After missing my chance to see it at Anime Expo, I have waited a whole goddamn year to catch Your Name in a Canadian theater. But while the best-selling anime film of all time takes a goddamn eternity to finally come out in Canada, we get Sword Art Online Ordinal Scale a month after its Japanese release. Needless to say, I'm not happy. Well, I mean, my wallet's happy, but I'm not. After finding 3 whole long videos worth of stuff to hate about Sword Art Online, it should come as no surprise to you that I hated this movie too. But there was actually reason to be hopeful for it. After all, Tomohiko Ito still serves as the director, and given good material, he's been known to make good anime. And this is an anime original story. I mean, so was the one where Kirito took a meeting while all of the girls sat by the pool in bikinis, but I digress. As an anime original story, it has no obligation to follow the awful, awful writing of... Oh wait, Reki Kawahara wrote the screenplay with Ito, who is a director, not a writer, so that doesn't help at all. I guess that explains why the script makes no fucking sense. Well, okay, to be fair, Ordinal Scale isn't as bad as it could be. That is to say, it's not nearly as irredeemably awful as the rest of SAO. Taken in a vacuum, it's not an abject failure of a film. What a glowing recommendation. I mean, yes, the writing is awful, but not offensively awful. It has some very nice animation cuts, the music is great when you can hear it, and at least 60% of it is competently made. It won't be taking home any awards, but hey, at least nobody gets raped in this one.
お前何を?
シリカちゃん!
俺がもっと AR の戦闘に慣れていれば、俺はどうすればいい? どうすれば?
Sword Art Online.
Oh, spoiler alert for the surprising lack of rape, I guess. And also for the whole movie, so if you're just here to hear my opinion about it before seeing it yourself, don't watch this video instead. The movie fucking sucks. To that end, in brief, the plot goes as follows. There's a new piece of high-tech gear on the market called Ogma that's taken Japan by storm. Ogma uses perception-altering tech similar to nerve gear, but instead of knocking you out and putting a virtual world in your dreams, it overlays virtual objects, up to and including entire virtual worlds, onto the real world. If you've seen Microsoft HoloLens, you can already guess that this thing is pretty darn cool and useful. It's as portable as a cell phone, but much more versatile and user-friendly, so of course everyone is using them. And part of this hype is a new AR game, Ordinal Scale, which has everyone in Tokyo running around and LARPing, essentially, as they work together to take down boss monsters and, I don't know if they do anything else in the game, because none of the minute-to-minute gameplay loop is actually shown, and it doesn't seem like they really designed anything except for some of the boss encounters. But this isn't a video about bad game design in the Sword Art Online series. I've done enough of that. For now, I may come back to that. Now, everyone who survived the Sword Art Online incident has been given one of these things for free, because that's not suspicious at all, and reactions to it are mixed. Well, actually, basically everyone likes the Ogma and Ordinal Scale, except for Kirito, because he's bad at it. Which is at least a slightly better reason than the generic protagonist doesn't trust new technology because he thinks it might be evil trope, but it turns out that the Ogma and Ordinal Scale are being used to evil ends anyway, because apparently the only MMO in this universe that's not part of some secret conspiracy is the one that's probably a money laundering scheme. It turns out that through secret events that see Ordinal Scale players fighting bosses taken straight from SAO, the Ogma is stealing people's memories of Sword Art Online for some nefarious purpose. And it's all somehow tied to Yuna, the AI idol who serves as the game's image character, as well as this ghost girl who the movie plays up as this big mystery, but who is obviously also Yuna, just wearing a fucking hoodie. It also has something to do with Eiji, the best player in Ordinal Scale, who used to be the worst player in Sword Art Online, and who goes around metropolitan Tokyo physically assaulting random strangers. Subtlety is clearly not in his villain playbook. Long story short, Asuna gets her memory stolen, and so do Klein and a bunch of other people, but they don't don't matter because they're not Asuna or Kirito. Actually, Kirito specifically only goes after Asuna's memory. He doesn't give a fuck about any of his other friends who've had their memories stolen. He talks to the guy who created the Agma, Professor Shigemura, who is obviously the mastermind behind the whole thing because aside from Kirito, males in the SAO universe can only ever be villains or jobbers. And the government won't help either because plot contrivance, so Kirito has to find another way to get Asuna's memory back. And to do that, he needs to reach the top of the leaderboards? And at no point does anyone think to call the police on the guy who's going around breaking people's arms? Like he pushes down a little girl in the middle of a crowded public square, and nobody around them even tries to stop him. I'm not even into the details yet, and already this movie makes no goddamn sense. Okay, so Kirito gets good at Ordinal scale, but not good enough to beat Eiji. And Eiji says, come 1v1 me at the Yuna concert, bro. And conveniently, Kirito has a ticket because tickets were given to every SAO survivor, and oh my god, could this trap be any more obvious? Kirito beats Eiji up, but he learns that he's almost, but not quite too late to stop Professor Shigemura's master plan, which is to use a bunch of drones to steal everyone at the concert's memories so that he can use them to reconstruct his daughter Yuna, who died in SAO, as an AI. Only these drones just happen to be super powerful, so when he activates them, they're gonna steal everyone's memories so hard that it'll probably kill them. To stop that, Kirito and his friends have to sit down and beat the true final boss of SAO in a totally unrelated video game fight scene. A+ writing there, Kawahara. The day is saved thanks to the Powerpuff Girls, everyone gets their memories back, somehow, and then Kirito takes Asuna to see a meteor shower and asks her to marry him, despite, and this is something the film reiterates several times, having never met her mother. Obviously, this movie is all over the goddamn place, but to properly understand what a mess it is, we need to dive deeper and really examine everything that it does wrong. And I'm not talking nitpicks like how fucking stupid the scene where Yui flies through a drone camera into the internet, represented as a series of tubes trying to catch someone's memory is. That scene is really fucking stupid though. Now, to give credit where it's due, the film actually has some neat ideas behind it. It does nothing with those ideas, like all of the neat ideas behind everything SAO, but at least they're there and worth acknowledging. The concept of building an AI copy of someone based on other people's memories is intriguing and raises a number of interesting questions. Even if that AI has the same personality traits as the original, for instance, could they ever truly be that person without their exact memories? Is there some way of extrapolating those memories from other people's memories using some kind of algorithm? Would inaccurate memories distort their personality somehow? How would the AI change as it becomes closer to the real deal as more memories are added? The movie never addresses any of these questions. In fact, it somehow has an objective counter, like a loading bar that tracks how much like the original Yuna, AI Yuna is becoming. But even at 95% Yuna-ness, her father still says that she's just a copy acting on programming. It's bizarre. The Agma itself is another intriguing aspect of this movie. It seems really cool and useful. I can totally see this thing replacing the smartphone, but it also raises some interesting questions. Like, if you have a device that can blend realities, does it become more difficult to separate the real and virtual worlds? How do you switch off when someone can start a karaoke game anywhere? Or if you're constantly staring at a heads-up display, will you start missing out on the little details in the real world? Will socialization change when everyone has instant access to your social media in the middle of a conversation? Again, none of this is really addressed in the movie. They use the Agma to get coupons, watch Hatsune Miku performances, and play video games, but there's potential there. If you're curious, some of that potential is explored in Denocoil and to a lesser extent Ghost in the Shell. And while it's not interested in saying much that's meaningful about the potential of AR aside from it's safer than VR because you can move your body while you play, it does at least present a lot of different, very appealing use cases for the tech that would probably make people want to buy one. Assuming they can get past certain issues with the design, but I'll get to that. One thing I kind of like is that for once, Kirito is shown to be bad at something. A video game, no less. He's used used to VR games that let him perform at peak effectiveness all the time, and he can't fight effectively in Ordinal scale because he's out of shape from playing so many other video games. He looks like a schlub even next to Klein, and Eiji kicks his ass. So, does this movie finally humanize Kirito by taking him down a peg? Of course fucking not. Over the space of a week, he goes from sucking at Ordinal scale to being literally the best player on the goddamn planet. And he doesn't even have to do any exercise to make it happen. He just starts soloing multiple secret event bosses every night because he's now properly motivated because Asuna's memory got stolen, and I guess the power of love burns a lot of calories. On the subject of those secret bosses, I have no idea how in the hell they got away with using them. I mean, for starters, Ymir owns all of the copyrights for Sword Art Online's world and characters, which were sold to them by Rect Corporation as part of Alfheim Online, and they originally acquired them when they acquired the servers for Sword Art Online from Argus when Argus shut down. Why do I know this? Oh god. Anyway, the point is that Ymir owns the copyright for Sword Art Online, and there's no way in hell that they just let a competitor steal all of that content and use it in a different video game. Japan is super strict about copyright. Just look at how much I have to cut this footage of the movie up to avoid content ID claims. I got a content ID claim on a Naruto video that was sponsored by an official Naruto video game. Reki Kawahara has to know that because he works with TV Tokyo, who are the worst. So this, on its own, is a pretty huge plot hole. But even if you could get the rights to use SAO's bosses, why would you fucking want to? Some of these things are responsible for dozens of real-world deaths. That's a PR nightmare waiting to happen. Obviously, Shigemura and Eiji need to use these bosses to trigger the memories of SAO survivors, but how would they get their shareholders, or the sponsors who promote themselves with in-game rewards, or the government to sign off on something that controversial? That's right, the goddamn government financed this thing and helped build the infrastructure that makes it work. So there's no way you can throw any hand-wavy nonsense my way about Shigemura building the game himself using only an AI, the way that some of you say that Kayaba Akihiko did with SAO, which, man, I don't have time to get into it now, but that only makes the show dumber. With the government backing this thing, there's no way that the project would go through without heavy oversight, which makes it extremely unlikely that Shigemura would get away with modding the hardware to steal memories in the first place, but also that the device could exist at all. At the end of the movie, it's explained that the Ogma uses repurposed nerve gear hardware, which is why it can kill people. But that hardware has to be regulated, and there's no way that the government would sign off on that design. That would be like if they started making in-flight entertainment systems out of Galaxy Note 7 hardware. And on that note, you'd think that for at least some people, there would be security concerns over having a computer that interfaces directly with your brain to create illusions indistinguishable from reality that is wirelessly linked to cellular networks. Because I can imagine that being used to pull off some Laughing Man shenanigans at the very least. Or, I don't know, steal people's memories or something. And at least one person in this universe has to have watched Ghost in the Shell at some point. Or, I mean, let's just look at the real world for a second. This device requires floating drones scattered throughout the city to function. People are already paranoid about private citizens flying drones around their neighborhood, never mind a big corporation working with the fucking government. How is everyone just cool with this? Is SAO's version of Japan a dictatorship? How did this get approved? Some of you will say it's unfair of me to criticize an anime for not going as in-depth as Psycho Pass or Ghost in the Shell in exploring its technology, but it's seriously incongruous and takes me out of the film to think that nobody in this entire universe has any concerns about the Ogma in regards to privacy and hacking. For a film that is so dedicated to showing off the potential of this technology, it doesn't seem to actually have anything to say about it. Also, the interface that they use for it is dog shit. I've gotten into this before, but if you have a brain-computer interface, then you don't need to to use gestures. Actually, the movie seems to forget that AR is even a thing half the time. Obviously, a big part of any SAO movie is going to be the action scenes, and the big hook of Ordinal scale is that they take place in the real world. And I will give the movie this: it's cool as hell to see virtual worlds mapped onto real spaces like Akihabara, which I've been to. But in all respects, aside from occasional nods to reality, the movie ignores this premise entirely. In the very first fight, Kirito can clearly move at the same ludicrous speed that he was capable of in SAO, although he does trip, and Eiji jumps off a 3-story tall walkway in the real world to deflect an imaginary rocket. No two ways about it, this would have broken his goddamn wrist. And speaking of breaking wrists, we see Eiji flipping people over his head with one hand and slamming them into walls with like machine strength, and nobody seems bothered by this. The closest anyone comes is Silica saying that he moves like a gymnast, when no, he fucking doesn't. He moves like a goddamn anime character, and this is supposed to be the real world. They try to hand wave it by giving Eiji this glowing robot thing on the back of his neck that supposedly enhances his strength and agility, but it's never explained how that would actually function, and it's totally out of step with how everything else in the SAO universe works. There's zero basis for this device existing. In Excel World, which is set 25 years after SAO, using neural linkers to speed up human perception of time by just a little is bleeding edge technology, and it only works for people who've used neural linkers from birth. Now, Excel World is a whole other level of stupid bullshit, but at least be consistent with your stupid bullshit, Kawahara. And even if you can suspend your disbelief for this ludicrous device that contradicts the show's own internal logic, that doesn't explain how Kirito can leap off a balcony in the concert hall and be totally fine like one scene later without using it. And that's far from my only problem with the fight scenes. The movie is packed with action, most of it very well animated and full of visual spectacle, but very little of it means, well, anything. For the most part, every fight scene in the movie is just the characters playing a video game. Some of the bosses we see characters fighting in Ordinal scale are really cool. The animation is slick, like I said, and the action is decently exciting, but without a narrative reason to care about what's happening. It's all padding and fluff. You may as well just have a street randomly start exploding in the middle of a dialogue scene for all of the difference it makes to the plot. No matter how nice the effects are, or how great the idols singing over the fight sounds, which is one cliche that I thought SAO would manage to avoid, but I guess they proved me wrong on that front. It doesn't matter. It's not necessary to the plot. The only purpose of these scenes is to keep the audience from getting bored, which is kind of necessary because my fucking god, is this movie boring. It essentially exists in one of two states. If characters aren't fighting, they are almost invariably sitting somewhere, eating or drinking, and talking. Digibro made that cafe counter joke in his SAO 2 teardown, but I think this may actually be the only way that Reki Kawahara knows of delivering exposition. For instance, everyone plays ALO just to sit around Kirito's virtual house drinking tea and discussing what to do next. You people live in the same fucking city! Half the time, the dialogue is barely even animated, at least not beyond what you'd expect from an A1 Pictures TV broadcast that is stiff, generic, and unexpressive. In a TV show, I can understand cutting some corners on dialogue, but this is a feature film. There is no excuse for the expository scenes to be this lazy and dull. And while they clearly got the lion's share of the budget, a lot of the fight scenes aren't all that technically impressive either. Take that stupid moment with Eiji jumping off the walkway to save Yuna from a rocket, even though she probably can't die because why would that be programmed into the game? As if the scene weren't hard enough to follow simply on the grounds that it makes no goddamn sense. The camera work and editing is awful! The problem is that there's no coherent line of action across the screen for anything. Kirito and Asuna are running left to right, then this tiger guy runs in front of them right to left, but when he goes to fire, suddenly he's facing right. The rocket moves away from the camera and slightly to the right. Here the action briefly becomes coherent. Eiji moves toward the camera and from right to left to deflect the rocket, which at least puts him on a collision course with it in our minds. Then it hits the samurai in the back, moving in the opposite direction from where it was heading in the last shot, but then suddenly the camera is directly behind Eiji as he lands. Because of all the quick cuts and the fact that the camera breaks the invisible 180-degree line like 4 different times in the sequence, it's very difficult to follow the action or figure out where any of the characters are relative to one another. And this is a consistent problem in just about every fight scene. So is the audio mixing, which is so bad. The weapon sound effects are about 40 times louder than everything else in the mix, to the point that every hit sounds like a fucking gunshot. And when it's not outright deafening, it's just distracting. Good Foley is supposed to go unnoticed, not... It's not always pretty either. Most of the animation is really solid, but some of the CGI is composited so poorly that it looks like an actual AR game, like Pokemon Go being projected into the real world through a smartphone. I think Tomohiko Ito is a talented director overall. Erased and Death Note make more than a strong case for that, but I'm getting the distinct impression that he can't direct action for shit. I have a whole video planned on that subject though, so stay tuned for that. In the meanwhile, let's get back to the shitty writing. Out of all the fight scenes in this movie, and there are a lot, only 2 of them involve any kind of substantial conflict with an actual villain. And out of those, only 1 has any meaning for either of the characters involved. One is Eiji's fist fight with Klein, which actually feels pretty well done and grounded in reality up to the point where he starts demonstrating super strength in addition to his enhanced anime reflexes. The other is the parking lot brawl with Kirito, which only really means anything to Eiji as the villain because it's his chance to prove that he's better than the best player in SAO once and for all. For Kirito, there are basically no stakes outside of the MacGuffin of Asuna's memory. Stupidly, this is the last point in the film where the protagonist directly confronts an antagonist, and it's not part of the climax. Instead, the climax involves every character sitting down and using the Ogma, which is actually just a nerve gear, to full dive into Aincrad and fight the final boss. And it's a big, impressive boss that seems to have some interesting, if cheap, mechanics, one of which seems to be impossible to counter without ranged weapons, so I'm not sure how that would have worked in SAO, but again, it doesn't matter. I guess by the same token, it doesn't matter how all of the important characters from every previous arc managed to log into this final fight in Ordinal scale directly from the servers of ALO and Gun Gale Online somehow, with fairy magic or something, or why Yuki's ghost shows up to help Asuna attack the boss once. I should turn my brain off and ignore how completely fucking stupid and off the rails this scene gets, because it's just mindless entertainment. Doesn't fucking mean anything even in the story, so why should I fucking care? There is so much wrong with this fight scene, but the biggest problem is that it effectively takes the place of an actual conclusion to the film. Shigemura is just arrested off-screen by Kikuoka, and when Kirito comes out of the video game, the whole central problem of the brain scan killing people just kinda solves itself. Actually, let's talk about that for a second, because there's a lot of stupidity around this whole memory-stealing plot that needs to be unraveled. The whole central conflict of Ordinal Scale is that the Ogma is being used to steal the memories of SAO players so that Shigemura can use them to recreate his daughter. As I said before, it beggars belief that the Ogma could be secretly programmed to do this with so much oversight on the project, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. It seriously raises so many questions. At Yuna's concert, we see that Shigemura can trigger the scan at any time, so why wait for the monsters to kill players in order to do it? Why not steal their memories as soon as the SAO boss fight is over? And why can't they just brainwipe Kirito remotely when he gets too close? But the biggest problem with this whole plot is that there's no good reason why the Ogma, while downloading these memories, would also need to delete them from the brain of the user. All it's doing is copying data from the brain, which full dive hardware is already built to read brain without hurting people. So there's no reason for it to work this way. What we're told in the movie is that the electromagnetic scan of the brain performed by the Agma is damaging the spinal cord or something. The pseudoscience isn't very clear, and preventing specific memory recall. But that sounds like it's basically a fancy MRI, and MRIs don't cause brain damage. The nerve gear hardware is capable of causing brain damage, that's how it kills people, but only when it's overloaded and not during normal operation. That's something Kayaba Akihiko built and programmed it to do. So Shigemura must have programmed the device to erase memories after scanning them, but why the fuck would he do that? Leaving a bunch of people with targeted amnesia makes it exponentially more likely that he's going to be caught and stopped, which he is, and has no benefit to him in any way. It's implied that he thinks removing the traumatic memories is doing the SAO players a favor, but even the guy he's working with doesn't want that from him, and at the end of the movie, he doesn't care if he murders all of the SAO players, so it doesn't seem like he has their best interests at heart. And that murder scan is the most ridiculous part of all. Why would having more drones around cause the nerve gear to output more energy? Are the drones Tesla coils that wirelessly send more electricity directly to the devices? Because otherwise I don't see any mechanic whereby receiving a stronger signal would cause the Agma to send a stronger signal out. I know! They just realized that the movie had no dramatic stakes, so they decided to artificially raise the tension for the final act. Now, that might sound a bit confusing. Obviously, the stakes of the movie are that people's memories are being stolen, right? Mass amnesia isn't just nothing, except that it totally is. From what we see, this memory loss doesn't affect anyone's quality of life or interpersonal relationships negatively in any meaningful way. Like, it's been 2 years since SAO, so obviously Asuna and Kirito have a strong foundation for their relationship, even if one of them doesn't remember how it started, and Asuna still remembers how to fight and helps him in the battle, so it's not clear what she's lost, if anything. Klein ends up in the hospital, but not due to the memory loss, it's because AG broke his goddamn arm. And he still remembers that part and can give a detailed description of who did it, so remind me again how AG isn't in jail? I mean, the fact that no Laughing Coffin members are ever arrested, even though they're recorded in SAO's metadata as having committed murder, is a pretty big plot hole, but this is seriously ridiculous. It must seem weird that I keep harping on this point, but it literally matters more than anything else in the entire movie. Klein's arm is still gonna be broken in a few months, but Kirito is still gonna take Asuna on that meteor shower date, he's still gonna ask her to marry her, and she's still gonna say yes, even though she can't remember the promise. It doesn't matter at all that she forgot about it. And ironically, the ridiculous, inexplicable death factor shoehorned into the last act ends up being even less of a threat, because this is a filler arc, so nobody of even remote importance can die. Actually, nobody in the concert can die at all, because that would be newsworthy, and this problem has to go away quietly for the rest of the story to work. So even in a series that has utterly defanged the most remote threat of death, watch my video about Yui to see how it does that, this one is particularly toothless. The only character who can die is the AI who is already dead. Predictably, and with no emotional weight whatsoever, she does. Actually, the same goes for the memory stealing. Even if there were some risk of the memory loss affecting Asuna's quality of life, we know that it won't, because at the start of the Alicization arc, she already has her memories back, so they have to find some way of restoring the status quo. Except, they kind of wrote themselves into a corner on that. Because as the pseudoscientific explanation we get from the Doctor indicates, this amnesia of the events in SAO is caused by minor localized brain damage, and a bunch of magical glowing orbs from a wannabe glowing idol aren't just gonna fix that. But at the last minute, the movie decides that memories aren't data stored in the brain after all, but like a physical object that can be freely given and taken away. This movie, hell, this entire series, has a tendency to just forget its own rules whenever they're inconvenient. Can you see why I think the writing in SAO is so abysmal? The only explanation that even kind of makes sense is that maybe Yuna is rewriting her stored memory data back into the brains of all the players that she took it from. But that also raises some huge questions. The biggest being, how? In the Fairy Dance arc, Oberon invested billions into figuring out how to manipulate memories with nerve gear, and the experiment was a failure. It bore no fruit. How is an AI copy of some random little girl able to do what a big corporation and a professional programmer couldn't? And on the subject of that random little girl, it sure is convenient that she happens to be a good singer and cute enough to be a successful mascot for a video game, because if that weren't the case, Shigemura's whole plan would have failed right off the bat. There are a lot of contrivances surrounding Yuna. It's almost like they decided to write a cute girl into the movie before they even figured out how she'd fit. But the most contrived thing about her is her death. Yuna dies, apparently having gained some semblance of true self-awareness, because Kirito beat the final boss of SAO, and for some reason part of Yuna's code is tied to the script of that monster. So when the monster resets, Yuna will disappear. I guess that makes sense, except that it totally fucking doesn't! Firstly, they could just copy the code for the final boss that they need to another file and have Yuna run off that. Crisis averted. Secondly, why base her off of that data in the first place? We already know that the maintenance AI of SAO like Yui are much smarter than the boss monsters, so yeah. It's almost like they got to the end, realized that nobody had died yet, and bent over backwards to find some way to kill anyone off. I mean, they had to be doing this to fill a quota, right? There's no way that they thought that killing Yuna would actually elicit an emotional response, because if they did, oh boy, did they fail miserably. She barely has any dialogue to get us attached to her throughout the entire movie, and her death scene is just fucking nothing. The only emotional hook in this entire movie that works at all is one scene, which surprisingly involves Asuna and Kirito. And that scene only works in a vacuum if you ignore the context of the rest of their relationship in the series, where Kirito is constantly almost cheating on her with new, more marketable waifus, and she's constantly finding new ways to be even less relevant to the plot. I could pick this movie apart for days. Why does Eiji say in his own internal monologue that he's out for revenge when his primary motivation is clearly that he wants to bring his dead friend back? Why does Kayaba Akihiko just show up out of fucking nowhere in the movie's climax? Why does nobody in the stadium take their fucking Ogmas off when they realize that the fire exits are locked? That's kind of a big red flag, don't you think, guys? This video's already over half an hour long at this point, and I've got some collab stuff to work on, so I think I'm gonna call it a day at this point. I will be shitting on SAO in the future though, so if you want to catch that, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for Mother's Basement. If you like this video, maybe spread the hate to some of your friends via Twitter or other social media type things. It helps the channel, and they can have a laugh if they don't like SAO, and if they do, well, maybe they'll like it a little less by the end of this video. Thank you for doing, well, any of what I just asked of you, and thank you especially if you're one of the lovely people who chooses to support me on Patreon. You make it possible for me to turn things that are supposed to be simple movie reviews into huge multi-day projects, and I love you for that. If you want to see more of me tearing down SAO, then I've got a whole playlist up here for you to peruse. Or if you'd like to see me talk about something that I actually like from the same director, then you should check out my videos on Erased. I think that they're some of my best. But if this is the last that you see of me today, then I'm Geoff Thew, professional shitbag, signing out from my mother's basement.